So hello everyone, this is now recorded. What we want to do today is build an SPA, so a single page app. But we're going to build it somewhat vanilla, right? We're not going to use React or anything of the sort. We're not going to use pure JavaScript either, because we're going to use a templating library called Handlebars. But apart from that, everything is going to be done manually. And our objective is to see kind of what the general structure of such an application would be, and what the challenges we're going to need to what the problems we're going to need to address would be. Now, for the back end of our application, we're actually going to use a server which is similar to what we've done last time. I'm going to have to somewhat modify something because I don't think I have this. I have it on this computer, so let's just fix this. One sec. Mm, right. So I have a package JSON in the server.js. I'm going to clear much of this and just going to paste what we need. But as it's the book API we've done last time without many differences. So we're gonna need SQLize. One sec. Okay. So this part is going to be identical. The only differences are these two lines, and they need requires. So this line is going to allow me to do cross-origin resource sharing, which means typically when I do a request and when I load a resource from a particular server, that's the origin of the request. And after that, one sec. Okay, let me just pause the recording. Right, so here I have a line which says app use course. This is obviously a middleware, and this middleware is going to allow me to do cross-origin resource sharing, which means I'm going to be able, so the way my single page app application is going to work is that I'm going to load a single page, and that page is going to contain a bunch of JavaScript. Now, the page has been loaded from a particular server, which means it has that server as its origin. Typically, I'm not going to be able from my JavaScript to request resources from a different server. Uh, Unless I have this middleware which allows me on that server. Um, we don't need this locally, and we may not need this ultimately within the course, because what we want to do is to go through it again. We want to build an SPA, but ultimately what we want to do is to deploy it on Heroku, just like you're going to have to do for your exam, right? So we're going to build a simple SPA with its backend, and we're going to have it visible in the internet. So that's why course is there. The second line I see here is this one, app use express.static. Now we're going to, so actually this course line is redundant. But this line is going to allow us to deliver static resources from our server. So our server, whenever it receives a request, is going to wonder if they can deliver a static resource in response to that request. And if they can, they're going to do it. Now, these resources are just going to be delivered as files from a folder, and we're going to call it public. Now, if I work locally, I can actually just say express static of public. Something tells me though, this is the actual way of doing it though, and something tells me we're going to need this on a container on the internet. And what I'm doing here is I'm taking one of the global variables that has been populated by the interpreter, which is called dir name, and this is the directory that this JavaScript file was run from. and I am concatenating it basically with public. Now what path.join does, path is a module which came with the interpreter. Let's import it. As it creates this path independent on the particular path separator the operating system has. Right, so it's in Windows it's backslash, and in Linux it's slash. So basically what I'm saying is it's from whatever folder, whatever directory my server was ran, I have a public subdirectory, and that's where I'm going to get my to have my SPA. Now in this one, since we're doing something relatively simple, we're just going to have one file, and let's say the file, which is has a title of a simple app. For now, it just says I will be the UI. So let's see if this happens first. So we're going to need a couple of dependencies. So we're going to need Express, Sequelize, SQLite 3. I think that's it. If it's not it, we're going to install whatever other dependencies we have. Right, this should install shortly. We can now run our server. And if we go to this window and we go to http.localhost on port 8080, we should see I will be the UI. Since we're here, let's also do sync. We forgot to uncomment it. Let's uncomment sync and do that, so we can have our tables created. We're going to give up this way of creating our tables soonish. However, for now, let's use it. So now if I go to books, I basically have my old API, and this returns an empty list of books because I don't have any. I already have a request for adding a book, which has a title and the content. So this is a post request which has a header of content type application JSON, and I have something book-like in the request body. So let's add a couple just so we have something to work with. Now getting back to our SPA, obviously for now our application does nothing. So let's see how we'd structure something like this. So first things first. What I'm going to, like I said, we're going to use something which is a templating library. Now this templating library is called Handlebars. Let's just look at Handlebars for a sec. It has a relatively complex behavior, but we're not going to use it. So what we're interested in is something a lot simpler, which is something which does just simple templating. And if you look at this, this is basically something similar to a string formatter. So I have a string, let's assume this is a string, and the string contains some markers, such as first name and last name. And I'm going to pass the string and an object containing keys corresponding to the markers, and I'm going to get another string in which the markers have been replaced. That's what templating does. Now we can actually get it from a CDN. This is going to mean that we request it from the internet. So a CDN is a host for a bunch of frequently used assets, because these rarely change, right? Because they're widely used, and conversely, they're used by many people. So there's an advantage in having them distributed geographically. So whenever I request something like this, something like handlebars, I'm going to get it from the building next door, basically, right? So it's going to be something which is close to me. So this is going to decrease request times. Now let's first do a handlebar thing and then discuss the rest. So our code is going to be here. And we're going to have a window.onload, and let's assume we have one of those handlebar templates. these are, so to speak, compiled before usage. So let's just name it as something we're going to expand on later on. So we're going to say const book view. One sec, books view, and this is just going to be a string. And for now, I'm gonna write it multi-line just so we can indent stuff. So for now, let's just say h1 slash h1 list of books. So the way we're going to use this, so this is let's say handlebars dot compile. Yes. So what happened when I loaded the script for handlebars is that in the global namespace, so in window in this case, I got an object called handlebars. Now the way to apply this is this structure of my body is not useful to me. So what I actually need is a container of sorts. So I'm going to have div id is UI. And what's going to happen is that after loading the page the first time, the content of this div is going to be changed from JavaScript. Right? So my page is going to contain a bunch of JavaScript. It's going to do some operations, some of them involving the server. Right? So it's going to do HTTP requests. And based on the results from these requests, it's going to change the content of this div. And all my application is going to be here. Now, there's something else to take into account, which is I might want to have pieces of my application be independently addressable, right? So I might want to be able to go to a particular state of my application. How would I do that? Well, a problem I'm confronted with is the fact that my application is a single page app, which means that the usual way of addressing resources over HTTP, such as going to another URI, is not going to work out because that would make it not single page. It would be going to a second page. So what I want to do is to go to a second place within my page. And I can do that via fragments, right? Which are something which comes after the sharp sign. They're also called hashes, um, which were initially invented to have bookmarks within a large document, but from a particular standpoint, we're using it just like that because we're addressing parts of our page, right? We're bookmarking parts of our application. So we want to be able to decide, let me just go to the browser for a bit. We want to be able to decide if we want to the root of the application or if we want to something like this, right? Or books one or something. Now, how would we go about that? Well, we actually have a handler on window which is called on hash change. So let's also put that in. So when the window loads, let's write console1 loaded, and window on hash change hash changed. And let's see what's gonna happen when we go to the root. We're going to need a console for this, obviously. Right, so the window was loaded. And this is called a single time, but see that the hash change handler was not called. However, on any subsequent hash change, I'm going to see hash change. Right. So this is how I'm going to handle my navigating from my application. Right. So let's say that in the when the window is loaded, what I want to see is this particular view. Now, what I want to do is render this view. So I'm going to say const UI is document get element by ID of UI. And now I'm going to take that template and I'm going to say const rendered is books view of some data, right? Because what I'm doing is I'm I am drawing the view within the context of a model, within the context of some data. Obviously, my view has nothing variable in it, so it's always going to look the same. But we're going to get back to that, and then I'm going to say UI.inner.html is going to be rendered. So let's see if this happens. Right, so it says list of books. Whatever I do for now, it says list of books. Right, so let's get back to that. So I want to do the same rendering logic whenever hash changes. I'm just going to copy this. But I noticed that this happens the first time that the page is loaded, and this happens whenever the hash changes. So probably I'd like to unify this. So I'm going to say handle view, where handle view is a function. So let's move this within handle view and say that the same thing happens on hash change. Right, so what would happen, for now we have one thing. So what would happen for this one thing? Well, we would load the data, so we would make a request to the server to load the list of books, and then we would draw something based on the list of books. Now, how would we draw that? Well, I lied for I lied a little in the sense that we're going to use one additional thing from handlebars. Handlebars has a relatively complex syntax, and it has something which are called helpers. And we're only going to use a helper which does iteration. So we're going to say each based on a key which we've sent. So each model. So for example, I could have said books view of model and this. This would have made sense. Of course, there's nothing in it. So each model, and then we end this with another block, which is each/each. Right, so assuming that model would be a list of books, for each of the books, we'd like to draw a table row. So we're gonna enclose this in a table. And for each of the rows, we're going to say tr. Right. And now we already know somewhat what the structure of a book would be, so we're going to have a cell for each of them. But the question becomes, if I'm iterating through our model, how can I address the current element? Well, I can address the current element by using this. So I have this.title and this.content. Now what's left to see in order to see the list of books is to actually get the data and see it. So let's hard code this, and then we're going to move a bunch of stuff around so it's easier to use. So considering that we only load the list of books, before rendering, we need some data. So we're going to have to request it from the server. Let's have a constant representing the server. And for now, let's hard code it. So we want to make an HTTP request. We can do this in various ways, but we're going to use fetch since it's included in the browser. Now fetch does have a somewhat less intuitive behavior in comparison to other libraries such as Axios. So let's do a fetch. So we're gonna say that handle view is async, and then we're going to say const response is await fetch server /books. Now I was saying that so by default this is a get request, everything's fine. I was saying that fetch does have somewhat of a stranger behavior than other libraries in the sense that in other libraries, if I get a response from the server such as a 500 or a 400, something denoting an error, I'm going to have an exception. Now in fetch, this is not true. The only way I'm going to get an exception by default is if the request could not be performed, such as due to network conditions or anything of the sort. So I have to check this. So I'm going to say if not response.ok, throw response. But if it is okay, we can say data is, this is the second strange thing about fetch, that the response doesn't contain the response body. So I have to extract it with something, in this case with response.json. So I can now send the data in the model here, and this should show me the list of books. Let's see if it does. Indeed, it does. Right. So this interaction seems incomplete, however, because I can't actually add the book. I can just see them. So I'd like to have a form to add a book. Now, how would I go about that? Well, we said that we want to regard our application as being something which is basically routable, right? This is what it's called. So I can put in different addresses to go to different state of my application, and we're going to elect to represent the form as such a different state. But what would that state be, right? How would we go about it so that we don't have too much chaotic code? Let's just try to put things in, let's say, in different little boxes. So this thing, right, which says gets the data and so forth, maybe it should be a function which is called load_all. Right, and then it returns data. Right, now something which we're not going to be able to handle elegantly is the state of our application. Now, obviously, when we're going to use React and Redux, we're going to have more flexible mechanisms for this. But for now, we're just going to keep global state, which is a bad idea, but it's enough for our purposes. So what we're going to do in handle view here, we're going to say, initially at least, we're going to say data is await load_all. Right, so what about the rendering part, right? This seems independent. So let's do a render function. And our render function is going to receive a view and a model. So it's basically going to render one of our views, and by rendering we mean just draw it, and by draw it means producing HTML and putting it in the UI container, right? So we have a UI container, and we're gonna put it there. So what can we move here? So this is interesting inside of render, and then we're gonna have this bit. But here it's not going to be book view. It's going to be just view because we receive the view as a parameter. And here we're just gonna put it like this because it's the same key and the same value. So this goes here, and at the end, well, this is not obvious right now, but we might need the UI to do, return UI to do additional stuff with it. Right, so in handle view here, we just get the data, and then we say render of books view, which is the only view we have, and model, and data, sorry. Let's see if this works. Handle view. What? Sorry, let's just see what it is. Data. Data is not constant. Yeah, it is a. It's a variable, right? So it still works. But this is still isn't going to cover everything we need. So let's think about it for a bit. What would be the cycle of doing things? Right. So whenever I this handle view bit, which is going to be called every time something happens, the page loads or the hash changes, should do this. Should identify the view it's supposed to handle, right? And then it's supposed to do stuff with that view. So if we think about it, the way that this is going to happen is we need the view. Let's just take this out for a bit. So I'm gonna say const view is get view. Well, get view of what? Well, it's based on the address, right? So, and the address we can get from window.location, but we don't actually care about the whole location. We care about the hash, so just the part after the sharp sign. And I'm going to render things of view and data, but I no longer have data. Right, so in the sense that I do have data, but the data is no longer contains what I needed to. So there's two more steps, right? So what might happen is that in order to draw a particular view, I'm going to need to have a particular set of data. Now something else which happens here, which is if I think about my views are what are called dumb views, right? So they don't have any behavior. This is just a string, which means if I need something to be clickable here, after I've rendered it, I want to go around and bind event handlers to whatever needs it. Now, if I think about these two moments, they're going to happen for any view I might invent, right? Which means I can identify, let's call them lifecycle points, right? So whenever I talk about a view, I can talk about some moments within the life cycle, the life of a view. And one of them is render, which is the most important thing about the view, that it's rendered. But before render, I'm going to have something, and after render, I'm going to have something. Let's just call them on enter, right, and on rendered. Now, what I might do is that at these particular points within the life of a view, I might run some functions. These would be lifecycle functions or lifecycle methods if they're on an object. And this is actually the way that code used to be represented in React. We're not going to write like that, but it's a valid way of representing things. And obviously, what we're basically doing here is we're reinventing the wheel somewhat so we understand what's happening. Right, so I got the view somehow, and now I'm gonna say, okay, so if the view is going to have a, let's say, instead of view, let's say we had a view description or a view definition, right? And this contains the view, but also a bunch of other things. So if view definition contains something which is on enter, I'm going to run it. Okay. Now, obviously this is not correct, so it's a view definition dot view because the view we've moved it one level lower. And after I've drawn the view, if the view definition contains on rendered, we're going to run that. Again, my view might not contain one or both of them. Now, why did I do this here? Right. So if I think about how this worked previously, I had to load the books in order to display them. So this would be something which would go within on enter. So it's time to see get view and to see get view and to see how we represent these views. So this is going to produce a view based on a hash. So let's just write get view. So in get view, which is something of hash, I ultimately want to return such a view definition. In order to return it, I'm going to have a bunch of mappings. And this is basically a really simple router. Uh, Now, we'd like our router to be a bit more civilized than we're going to write it. Unfortunately, there's a feature which handles parsing URLs, which is under implementation, and we don't have it yet. So our matching logic is going to be based on regular expressions. So how might I get to books? Well, I might get to books if I get to the root of my SPA, and this is going to mean that I'm going to have an empty hash, right? So this is the start of a string and the end of a string. Additionally, I might get there if I go explicitly. So if I go to #books, these are going to be identical actually. So how would this view definition look like? Well, it's going to have a view, which is going to be the only view we have, and it's going to have an on enter possibly, but not necessarily. I might omit one of these, and possibly it's going to have an on rendered. Right, so as for our on enter, we already know what it's supposed to do because we've already written it. So it's data as await load all. And on rendered, we don't need it yet. We're going to put it in shortly. However, this, like I said, is identical to this, so we can test things up until this point. It doesn't match. There's an error. It's going to match at some point, but not right now. And there's another error. Undefined on enter. Right. Oh, we forgot to put in the actual logic. Right, so given these mappings, what I'm supposed to do is to see if the hash matches any of them and return the value for which the key matched. Which means I'm going to go through the mappings. Now they're strings, but I want to use them as regular expressions. So to do this, I can use mapping regex. I'm going to say new regular expression of mapping. And to avoid a series of problems, let's say this ends here, right? So it's #books and then the end of the string. Now, given this regex, the string type has a method called match. So if hash dot match regex, then we have a winner, right? So return mappings of mapping. Right, so now it should work unless we forgot something else. Right, it does work. And it also works if I just go to the root of the thing, right? The same thing. Right, so what does this have to do with our add form? Because that's where we started. Well, first things first, we could go to the add form directly. So we're going to have a method here which is going to say that. So the key is going to be #/add form and some definition. And we could also go to the add form possibly by clicking something in the list of books, which is my default view. Now, whenever I say clicking something, I don't have any handlers here, right? So I have to add them somehow. So first of all, I need my button. So I'm going to say input type button value add, and I think that's it. No, let's give it an ID. And I want to say whenever I click this, it goes to add book. Now the way we've thought it out is that in unrendered, I can add handlers. Right, so onRendered is a, first of all, it's a method, it's a function of UI. So we can do UI dot query selector something with the ID add form on click, and this is just going to navigate us to add form. So window dot location is going to be server slash sharp slash add form. That's fine, but assuming that I get to add form, the problem I'm going to have is I don't yet have a view. Let's say we have a add book view, and we're gonna see about the other two on enter and on rendered. Now, like I said, these parts are identical, so this is supposed to do the same thing. Right. So we need this add book view. Now this is going to ultimately be a form, but for now we're gonna say handlebars compile. It's just going to be title, just so we see that we can get there. Right. So now if we refresh this, we have a button. We forgot something, unfortunately. So right, so onRendered is onRendered of UI, which UI is returned by rendered. Okay, so this is add form. It's add button actually, what we're selecting. And this is, let's call it add book, just for consistency. Right, so this navigates me to add a book. Obviously, the add a book doesn't do anything for now, but we'll handle this shortly. Right, so I have a bunch of views. So let's go to our form. Our form, in order to add a book, our form is going to have to have a form-like structure. It's not necessarily going to be a form tag because we don't care about the whole submit logic that usual forms have. We just care that we have some inputs. One for title and one for content. And probably we're going to need a little button which is going to perform the actual add. Radio. So do we need to do something on enter on this? Not really, no. It's it has nothing to load. But we do need to do something on render. And what we want to do is perform the actual is no, is add the handler to perform the actual request to the server. So we're going to get the add button, which is it looks the same, although it's a different button. And after we get the add button, we're going to make a request to the server. We could put this in a different function, or we could leave it here, right? So it's let's assume we put it in a different function. We're gonna say await add one of something. We don't yet know what. And then we're gonna go back to window location. We're gonna get back to books. So server to the list of books slash sharp slash box. Now, what would we send here? Well, we have to send whatever we have in the form, so we need a couple more things. So I'm going to say title input is UI.querySelector, something with the ID title. And content input, something with the ID content. And what we want to add is something which looks like a book. So this is going to be title input.value, because any input is going to have a value property, and content is going to be content input.value. Right, so let's, this is not going to work out unless we mark it as a sync. So let's do add one. Well, let's group it up with load all here. So we're going to say const add one is a sync. Now, the fetch, the code is going to look similar to this, right? So the fetch is going to be to server box, but it's going to be a post. Now, add one is something of a book. We do a fetch to books, but this is by default going to be a get, so we're going to say method post. Then, since fetch looks at things at a lower level than other APIs, we have to specify our headers. And we know from Postman, for example, that we need a content type. And we're also going to have to provide a body, which is going to be JSON.stringify, so the serialization of book. Right, so let's look at this right now. So we have our form, book, some content, and that worked out. Right, so we have a way of listing books, and we have a way of adding books, but we need typically we need some additional things. We'd like to be able to delete a book, and we'd like to be able to edit a book. Now, to delete a book and to edit a book, we're going to need buttons which allow me to refer to a particular book. So let's see about that. So let's say we have a couple of TDs, and each of them contains a button. And a similar one for edit. Now I have a problem here, which is maybe not necessary, not noticeable yet, which is when I click such a button, how do I know what book I'm referring to? Now what I'd like to do is to be able to associate each of these buttons, so the button on each row, with the book they refer to. If I think about this model, so the books I get from the server, each of the books contains title and content, but they also contain an ID. Now, I don't want to show the ID because that's bad practice, but I want to use it somehow. So I want to send it to each of these inputs. So typically I'd want to send it in an attribute, but I can't actually write ID because ID is an attribute which exists. How do I add a custom attribute such as I can rely on the fact that I don't have conflicts with existing attributes? Well, I can prefix it with data. So data ID is going to be this.id. Similarly, for edit, data ID is going to be this.id. I'm also going to probably need to select all these delete buttons, right? So I can't put an ID because there's multiple. So let's just put a class. Right, now obviously since I have to click on them, and this is a DOM view, I have to go back to onRendered for books view and add handlers to them. So let's go back to onRendered. like I said, unfortunately, this is duplicate, but you know. So there's more than one of them. So query selector all of delete, and this is not quite an array, but it has array-like methods. So it has for each. So for each of the buttons, I'm going to want to do e.onClick does something. So first off, I want to know what book I'm referring to. So this is going to be something of event. And all events have a property called target, which refers to the thing I actually clicked, to the element I clicked. So I can get the target, so I'm going to say const ID is event.target. And from the target, I can get attribute of data ID. So now I have my ID. Now this part probably is going to be similar for edit. Now what else edit does we're going to see further on. But what I want to do here is I want to delete a book. So I'm going to say await delete one. We don't have it yet, but you know, of ID. And then probably I'm going to want to reload the books. Now the reason why I want to reload the books is the fact that web applications are useful only if they have multiple users, basically. So if I don't reload the books, I might become disconnected from the server state. Somebody else deleted the book, and I am still under the impression that it exists. I want to avoid that, so I'm going to say I'm going to reload it. But I'm going to reload it by just going to uh, my state, reloading my view. Let's just go to the root of it. Right. Now delete one. We don't have it yet, but it should be somewhat intuitive in the sense that it's going to look like all the other ones, all the other methods which communicate with the server. So I'm going to say response is await fetch. Now this time the fetch is going to be to your URL, which is dependent on ID. I'm going to need to customize this, but only insofar as I have to say that the method is delete. Now, if not response.ok, throw response, and that should basically be it, unless we miss something. Let's see. So I should now, 17. Right. So I should now be able to delete something. Unfortunately, it doesn't seem to be happening. Let's see what we did wrong, because the click doesn't work. So that's what we notice. So let's see what we mapped. So we got all the deletes. Where is it? For each whatever's element on click is an event handler, etc. Let's look at this. Class delete. Oh, yeah, same mistake. This is because of my duplicate code. Right, so this works. Now what about edit? Well, edit is going to be a different state, and let's say we decide that when I go to books slash a particular ID, what I'm doing is editing a particular book. Right, so we're going to need a view and we're going to need some sort of mapping. Now the view is going to look similar to this one. Right, so it's going to edit and add are going to look similar. So let's call it edit book view. Edit a book. And probably the only difference is going to be this bit, right? The fact that it's an edit button and it says save or save button. Radio. So we have a similar thing. So we can go and add another mapping. Now this time our mapping is going to be somewhat different, right? Because it's going to be something which has a parameter. Unfortunately, like I said, we don't have an elegant way of doing this. So we're gonna just provide a regex. So we're gonna say books, and notice that this one says books and then it ends. In this case, we're gonna say books, and then how would an ID look like? Well, it's going to be some sort of digit except for 0, and maybe followed by other digits, and we don't know how many of them are. Right, so our view is going to be edit book view, and this time we're going to need both on enter and on rendered. Right, so why? Well, if we have an edit book form, sort of, we want to see the previous values of the fields of that book, right? So that means we have to load the book somehow. We're going to opt to load it from the server. So let's first let's have a function which is gonna be called load one, which is going to be an async function of some ID. Now, since we've decided to be relatively uncivilized with the state, we're going to keep that in the state in data as well, right? So we're not going to worry about this for now. So it's going to be a fetch server slash books slash ID. It's a get, we don't have to say anything else. However, we have to wonder if the response was okay, and if it wasn't, we're going to throw an error. Now, obviously, nobody's catching these errors, so not much use, because we don't have time to go into all the pieces of an actual application. So if the response was okay, however, we're gonna say data, no const, so just data is going to be, one sec, how did I write this one? Oh, it was returned. So const data is going to be await response.json, and then we're going to return the data. Now if we have load one, we can then call it here on enter. Right, so now we have a problem, right? Which is, what parameter am I going to pass to load one? We have to extract it somehow. But we do know that if we match this, we do have this kind of structure here. We do have a number there. Right? If it's been matched, obviously the address had this particular, let's call it shape. So let's say param is window.location.hash.split after our separator, and we need the last element, so we're just gonna say dot pop. So we can then send param here. So this is what happens before the view is rendered. Now, what about after? Well, after the view is rendered, let's just look at it. Right. I'm going to have a title, which is going to have to be populated from data, a content, which is going to be populated from data, and a save button. And I need all of them. Let's just get them here. So we're going to say this is something of UI. But this time I'm going to say title input.value, so its initial value is going to be data title. Similarly for content. As for our button, we need a click on it. Right, so what we need to do is to save this some way. So we're gonna say await save one of some ID, which is going to be our parameter, and some object. And the object is going to be whatever is going to be something which looks like a book, and it's going to have title, whatever is in title input.value at this time, and content, whatever is in content input.value at this time. Now the param, we're going to take the same as this. We have to repeat this code because we don't actually, these pseudo components we've written here don't actually have a state of their own. Obviously, this would be easier to do if we'd use the components-based framework, not reinventing the wheel. So I'm going to save one with that ID and this content. We don't have save one yet, but this is not going to be all that unintuitive in the sense that it's going to be just something that does a put request. Right, so const response, await fetch, server books ID. We have to configure this, so method is going to be put. Headers are going to be content type. And our body is going to be json.stringify of book. Now, what about after we've done this? Well, after we've done this, probably we want to re-navigate to books. Maybe that's enough. Right, so let's reload this and see what exploded. Alright, so it's 217. It's a sync, sorry. Alright, so this didn't work. The click. That's because we forgot to put the navigation on the click. So the navigation on the click, we've already selected the edit buttons here. but we've not put the actual logic. So the actual logic is window.location server slash sharp slash books slash id. So now we get here. Let's see if it also works. And indeed it does. So we have this little CRUD application, right, which is an SPA and which works locally. Now, what about if I want to put it in the wild? Now, there's a couple of observations. The way Heroku works, and we've selected Heroku, you know, incidentally. It's not there isn't something extremely important about Heroku. What's important is that the web is a particular environment, right? It has its particularities. And in order to think about web applications, you have to think about them in the wild, so to speak. Because if, for example, you pay for a server right now and you put one of your applications and you tell nobody, right? In about 4 hours, it's going to be attacked. So you have to handle this part, the deployment. You have to obviously you can't at this point, but you can have to think about security and so forth. Right. So we're going to deploy to Heroku. Heroku functions as a bunch of volatile containers. Does that mean? Well, whatever I put on Heroku is, can't actually save something in that container. Right? Whenever the container is restarted, which I can't control, all my data is going to get lost. I'm always going to be, it's going to be Groundhog Day. I'm always going to be at the beginning. So I can't use SQLite because what SQLite actually does is it edits a file. Right, so what else? Well, looking through Heroku, I have access to a PostgreSQL database and I can use that. And we're going to treat that as an opportunity because we're going to edit our application so that it can be developed locally over SQLite, but when I deploy it in production, it's going to work over PostgreSQL. Right, so let's do a couple of things in that direction. So let's go back to our app. And this part, for now, we're going to leave. And we're going to go back to server.js and change a couple of things. Now, if I talk about being in development or in production, how would I know that? Well, I can know that from an environment file. Now, my server actually ran with some environment. It's in process.env and I can actually print it if I want. But that environment has been provided by the operating system, right? Uh, well, it was mediated by my command line, actual command line interpreter. So I want to add something to that environment. How would I go about that? Well, first of all, I could add an env file. Now, what would I store in an env file? Well, I might store different kinds of things. For example, if I share the code with some other programmers, if it's open source or whatever, I might not want to leave passwords or API keys in the code. So I'm going to read them from the env, and the env is not going to be put in the repository. Now, talking about repositories, if I were to put this code in a repository, probably I'm only going to want to put the useful stuff in the repository, so no node modules. Now I'm going to take a file, a gitignore file from another place, from another project, and copy it here. If you look on the internet for a sample Node.js gitignore, you're going to easily find it. Now what the gitignore file does, it tells Git what to ignore. Um, right, one sec. So let's create a file here which is .gitignore. It's not this one. and it has a bunch of stuff. Now, what I might note is I don't really care about all this. It's literally a sample file, so it doesn't have VS Code stuff and so forth. But it doesn't have, so what's going to be ignored is this, so node modules. And also, I've added env. Let's just be civilized and call it what it is and say environment. Environment. Now, this actually has something to do with Heroku, because Heroku has to give me some parameters, such as where a database is, since it's a service on Heroku. And the way it's going to do it is by populating this environment. Either way, I'm going to be able to decide, for example, if I say node-env, and if I run this locally, node-env is going to be development. If I run it on Heroku, the value of this is going to be different. It's going to be production, but that's irrelevant. So what I want to do is go to my server and say, well, if process env node-env is development, well, this thing I've written before, it's fine. There's nothing wrong with it. The only thing I want to change is, since Sequelize is going to be populated on these two branches, I'm just going to declare it outside. But if it's not, if node-env is something other than development, then I'm going to want to use PostgreSQL. Now, how would I do that? Well, it's the same thing. Most of my code is going to stay the same. The way I'm going to populate SQLite, the way I'm going to create the SQLize connection is going to be different. PostgreSQL is an actual full-fledged RDBMS, right? So it's a relational database system, right? A server. It's not a file-like thing as SQLite. So I need a database, a user, and a password. Now, since these are going to be provided to me by Heroku, how am I going to get them? Well, I could get them separately, or I could get them through a database connection URL, which would contain all of them. So I'm going to get them, if I look in the documentation for Heroku, from process.env.database URL. Now this is not going to work because I need a couple more things. So first, dialect is going to be PostgreSQL, Postgres, sorry. Now, if I look at Sequelize in the documentation, I'm going to see that I actually need to do something else, which is I need to say protocol Postgres. And now we have a couple of workarounds. Now, typically, our application would also every kind of communication would be done over something secure. We can't do that, right? So we're going to work around it by saying dialect options, and say we do use SSL, so we do communicate securely, but we're not going to have a valid certificate because we can't actually pull that at this point. Okay. Right, so this is what we have to do to have it running. So this part we're going to get from Postgres. There's also something else we have to get from Postgres, which is the port that is opened. But for now, we're going to leave it as it is because we want our installation to fail. Just so we see how we can see the errors, and then we're going to make it work. Right. So the plan is it's going to work like this locally, and it's going to work like this remotely. Let's see if it still works locally, right? Because we can test that really easily. Not really. Let's see what it is. Received undefined. Right. Right. Sorry, we forgot something, which is well, this bit process env was written here, but this part never got to our application. That's because we have to use a tiny package called .env, which is going to load a .env file, that's why it's called .env, into the process environment. So we're going to say require .env .config. And here we can actually configure it, but we don't care. And obviously we have to install .env. And we have to install something else which we've also missed, which is the driver for PostgreSQL. It's called PG. Radio. So now we should have everything. Let's see if we've missed anything. And let's see if our application still works in development. Right, so this seems to be working. Right, it's still working. Right, so let's head to Heroku. You have to create an account with Heroku. So probably I already have an app from the previous course, but let's just delete it and start from 0. Right, so create new app. We don't care about anything. We have to install the Heroku CLI. This is really easy to install on Linux, and you also have an installer for Windows. Right, so you have the installer, and it's a snap package in Linux. It seems to be working on macOS also, but I haven't tested it. Right, so what Heroku does is it's going to treat my project folder as if it were a Git repo. Right, so I'm just going to go to the project folder. I am in the project folder and say git init. Now git init creates a repo in the current directory, but this repo is not connected to a remote origin, to a remote repository. So this is what happens here. And then, well, I have to add my files to be tracked, right? I have to track my files. I have to make a commit and push. So let's do this. Like I said, this is going to partially fail in the sense that it's not going to be able to run my server, and it's intentional. Let's say initial sample app. And now I have to do git push Heroku master. There's also another thing, which is that by default, I don't actually have PostgreSQL and I have to activate it. This is going to finish at some point. Let's just wait for it. So we see it's finished to deploy, and then we'll see if our application is working, which it shouldn't, right? It shouldn't be working because we've ignored something. We're going to fix it shortly after. Right, so deployment finished. Now if I go back to Heroku, we're going to ignore all this and we're going to say, right, and it says application error, and it tells me how I can see my logs. I can see my logs by doing this. And let's see what happened there. Well, we're gonna check it. It's not what I expected, but we'll fix it. So it says that at some point in we gave it a wrong, we gave it an undefined where it was expecting a string. Right, so let's fix what I was expecting to happen and then fix this. So what I was expecting to happen is that I'm supposed to give it the port like this. And on local it's going to be 8080. But on Heroku, this port isn't actually open. So I have to say process env port. There's also a problem we have, which is we have this endpoint which creates our things, which is sync. And we don't particularly like it because this is going to be exposed on the internet. So this is not going to go. We're just going to delete all this thing and go here and say, well, if the app after the app started, we're gonna do SQL sync, but we don't want to delete everything, so we're gonna do alter true. Now this can also fail, and the way it can fail is if I add a column. So this is going to try to alter table to add columns. If I add a column which is non-nullable, obviously, and I have existing records, it's also going to fail, right? So there's no way to do migrations all that elegantly. You have to write code, right? So if you have existing data models and data, there's no easy way of doing it. You have to populate the existing data with something that makes sense. Right, so we have this bit. Let's see what's going to happen here. I think what happened is that we don't actually have PostgreSQL. To have PostgreSQL, we're going to go back to our app, and our app can have a bunch of add-ons. And we're going to add the PostgreSQL add-on, so Heroku Postgres. We now have PostgreSQL, and that should mean that this is actually defined. So let's add again, commit. I'm supposed to write something which makes sense here. So let's say fixed connection errors, and then push again. Right. So right now we're going to try to open our app, and it still doesn't work. Let's see what happened here. Right, so this time I can see in the logs that what happened is that this function is supposed to be a sync. Radio. So let's see our app now. Failed to fetch. Right. We forgot something else, which is if we look at our index here, our server is hard-coded to localhost. But we have a solution for this, which is so if I think about the URLs I got on the server side, I could get them from the env. Now here I'm on the client side. I can't actually get anything from that env unless in some fashion I generate this HTML like React does. right? I don't have that env. But what I can actually do is get them from basically window.location. Let me just find this and reconstruct the server URL from that by combining protocol, um, the protocol, the server, and the port, which are going to be different. Let me just find it. Right, so it's going to be something like this. So it's window location, and this is going to work both locally and remotely. So it's window location dot protocol slash slash host name colon location port. Okay. Right. So we now have a list of books. And this works. And it's remotely on the internet, so you can access this as well. Right, so I think that would be it for today. I'm going to stop the recording and take any other questions you might have.